What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to Dig Within. Today, we've got an awesome one for you. Is the man himself, the one who I've wanted to have on since the beginning, since I first started this, Andrew Kaufman. Now, he's been on the front lines talking about the craziness that's going on in the world and the work that he's doing along with Tom Cowan, Stefan Lanka, Amanda Vollmer, all of those guys is just absolutely groundbreaking. They are breaking the spell left, right, and center. Had a great conversation with him. I think you guys are all going to enjoy it. So without any further ado, let's get into the podcast. All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. This is Dig Within, and today I have a man who really needs no introduction, but here's one anyways. I have natural healing consultant, inventor, public speaker, forensic psychiatrist, and expert witness. Completed his psychiatric training at Duke University after graduating from the Medical University of South Carolina, and has a BS from MIT in molecular biology. He's the man who I personally owe a huge debt of gratitude for his work exposing the current lie that is currently surrounding our world. And it's produced some fantastic documentaries on the subject titled Hippocratic Hypocrisy, and most recently, Terrain, the film. Welcome to the show, Dr. Andrew Kaufman. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for that lovely introduction.
Well, as I mentioned, your work has really been foundational. What you, Tom Cowan, Amanda Vollmer, all these people have been talking about since the beginning. I first heard you on Crow 777. I believe it was probably January or February of 2020. And that just being exposed to that conversation that early on was groundbreaking to me to understand that this entire thing is false. And I just, I could imagine understanding this information before 2020. And I just, like I said, I'm just completely indebted to the work that you guys have done. And before we kick things off, I'm just curious, you've been in this space for about 2 years talking about this, I would imagine day in, day out, making documentaries and all this kind of stuff. Before we dive into all things related to this conversation, is there anything that you've seen over the past 2 years leading up to today that you'd like to maybe start off with in terms of either wins or revelations or shifts you're seeing in the entire kind of narrative? I just wonder if you're tiring of talking about this conversation over and over again, but I was just wondering, was there anything that you'd like to kick us off with any new things in this space?
Yeah, well, rather than introduce new elements, let me instead kind of introduce how I'm really thinking about things, because there is, of course, some burnout and fatigue related to, continually having to debunk the same scientific misperceptions. But I would like to, draw attention to the work of Thomas Kuhn, who's a philosopher and talked about the philosophy of science, and really our current phrase of the paradigm shift comes from his work. And he looked at this from a standpoint of what can change, sway the public opinion from one paradigm, to a more truthful one. In other words, shatter the current paradigm. And, of course, we know about many historical examples of this. And, some of them may not be as favorable as we like toward progress. But in order to shatter the paradigm of germ theory, I think what we need, and what he said is always needed, is that there needs to be a new theory that, becomes familiar and accepted, that can take its place, and that people have a hard time going from, having an understanding in a certain framework and to admitting that they don't understand what's going on at all. So you need, like a new theory. And from the beginning, like some of the most frustrating questions that I was asked over and over and am still asked are related to this, because, people want to know, okay, well, if it's not, a virus or a bacteria that causes this or that disease, then what does cause it? And so I realized that we need to have a new theory, and I believe there's enough evidence to put forth a new theory, but it's going to be a little bit broader. And this is really where I was going with Marcy and the movie Terrain, because you can use the term terrain as an umbrella for all of the natural therapies that essentially acknowledge the issues of toxicity and how the environment and the ecosystem of our body actually determines our health. And then It doesn't dictate a specific path to healing, like that you have to use, essential oils or energy healing or, this or that. But it's an overall theory of how we can understand health and biology and illness much more accurately to nature. And then we can, from that, stimulate all kinds of research and discovery. And a lot of this is already going on. Like, for instance, this is new to me because I'm studying this voraciously now and talking about it and integrating it into my work, is this new science of water. And this has lent tremendous understanding to health and disease and allows a new conceptual framework, where we can understand that by damaging our water, which has this central function in biology through contamination and poisoning of various sorts, we can now understand exactly how our biology is disrupted and the need, to express illness and healing comes about.
Right. And I think that that's one of the most difficult things for someone in my position where I don't have a background in this at all, but I'm listening to people such as yourself and Tom and Amanda. And I say, listen, what the groundbreaking, I guess work that you guys are trying to bring to the world is that viruses don't exist, or they aren't the cause of disease, and we can go into exosomes and all that kind of stuff. But people immediately hear you're saying that no one has ever died ever from anything bad in the entire world. You know what I mean? And it's like it's this very hard conversation to have when you think that you're having a logical conversation with someone, and there's so much emotion tied within that. And I'm sure you've had that conversation as well, but what do you say to something like that where they immediately come back with, okay, well, you say, diabetes doesn't exist, that people have since birth and all that kind of stuff. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I would never say diabetes doesn't exist. I mean, I've worked with so many people with diabetes in my, conventional medical career and now as an educator in natural health. But what I'm really saying here is that we misattribute the cause of disease to germs when really there's another cause. But of course, these diseases are in fact real. We just have misunderstand their total nature, because actually when our body expresses an illness, what it's really doing is it's healing. And when our body actually experiences the insult, like what causes the damage in the first place, we often don't even know that that's happening, right? Obviously, if we're getting stabbed or something like that, we know it, right? But if we are, breathing the pollutants in the air, we don't feel it irritate our lungs necessarily. But when it builds up and our body has to purge it, we feel that process of healing and purging going on. And then we, through our culture, have been taught to understand this as our body is failing or there's an invader attacking us that we have to fight off. And so that means that every time we're experiencing a symptom, it reminds us that our life's in danger, rather than what I see as the truth, which is that those symptoms actually are evidence that our body's healing. And the reason they're unpleasant is because it's trying to get us to change our behavior to not cause that damage. And, this can be illustrated with a simple common example of when you're on the beach on a hot summer day. If you start walking on the sand with bare feet, right, your bottoms of your feet are going to hurt really bad. And you're going to, start running and tiptoeing and get a pair of sandals on or get your feet in the water. And that unpleasant sensation is information telling you, don't walk in this hot sand because it's going to burn the skin off your feet. And I once had a colleague with childhood diabetes who did this, and she ended up with second-degree burns on her feet, and because she didn't have that sensation because of the damage of the diabetes. So it's the same thing when you're going through an illness. That unpleasant sensation is providing information. Don't keep eating fast food, right? Stop smoking, or, stop drinking, or whatever it is, right? And I give those kind of obvious examples that we associate with disease, but it could also be, stop using chemical antiperspirant, or all of the toxic makeup products that you put on your skin, or stop dyeing your hair, or stop wearing plastic clothing that is leaching, plasticizing chemicals and endocrine disruptors into your skin. And we aren't really aware of those things very much unless you specifically look for it, because the mainstream health system doesn't consider it. It's not part of the germ theory model. But now I have several years of experience, because in terms of debunking allopathic medicine and discovering natural healing, I was on that path before I was certain about all viruses not causing disease, and all other germs not causing disease. But now I've had several years of experience hearing about people, working with people, doing things myself, and I see that through really detoxification or purification of those contaminants and toxins from the body is the way that people heal, and they heal completely from all of the so-called incurable diseases from Western medicine. And when you see this with your own eyes, even though you can't, there are no studies that are published because they don't actually study these. Like, for example, with fasting, you can find a lot of studies on fasting that show it's safe and beneficial, but they never take some group with serious disease and use it as a treatment and compare it to other treatments. Like, they've come close to doing this in cancer, but they have a little trick. They combine it with chemotherapy. And of course, they actually had superior outcomes, but if they compared it to chemotherapy directly, then no one would do chemotherapy anymore, because you'd see that just simply water fasting is much better treatment, and of course doesn't make you vomit and lose your hair and have no energy, and become anemic and need transfusions, and make the skin slough off inside of your mouth, and all of the other side effects that people get from chemotherapy, which was originally developed based on mustard gas used in World War I.
And isn't that sort of the problem where you have people doing work such as yourself and people in German new medicine spaces and the Gerson method and fasting and stuff like that. But anytime that there is a negative reaction, or anytime that there's some sort of death or something like that involved with going down that route, maybe that might be the time that that individual is supposed to leave this place. But but every single one of those is counted as this doesn't work. But the current model that's currently killing, X amount of people every single year from chemotherapy and radiation, all those different things, that's not contributed to the fact of like, hey, this isn't working.
Well, listen, if you just look at the published literature, you'd see that if you add up medical errors and pharmaceutical deaths published in mainstream journals, that allopathic Western medical care is at a minimum the third leading cause of death in the United States, right? But those studies are not highlighted or talked about as being decisive in the overall evaluation of the medical institutions. And it's really unfortunate that these things are simply glossed over. But we also have this, what I would refer to as obfuscation, going on in the medical literature about many of these natural treatments. And some of them, so fasting is actually touted as being very, very safe, but things like chlorine dioxide are said to be potentially very dangerous, right? Even though there's not actually a track record. And but there's one example I looked at pretty closely, and it's with coffee enemas. Now, coffee enemas, were kind of popularized, I think, through the Gerson protocol from the Gerson Institute, which is a clinic that has been around successfully helping people cure themselves of cancer for decades and decades. And coffee enemas is one of the mainstays of their treatment. So there's all of this anecdotal evidence about it being really, really effective. And if you look in the literature, there is not one study of it done anywhere. So what you do have are case reports. And these case reports are kind of ridiculous because, like, I've read several of them, and a typical scenario would be that there would be someone who is mentally ill or a drug addict and has a chaotic life, and they try to do a coffee enema, but they don't realize coffee is hot and they have to cool it to the right temperature before they put it in, and so they burn themselves. And so then they conclude coffee enemas are unsafe. Now that's like ridiculous. I mean, you could say, the same thing about drinking coffee, that it's unsafe because people don't know how to let it cool off. So you contrast that evidence. Now, a coffee enema is really a way to deliver coffee directly to your liver without, getting a big needle and sticking it in your liver, which would be very traumatic. And so you have this very scattered and scant literature saying coffee enemas are dangerous, but then you have this other literature about drinking coffee. Now, drinking coffee is a big industry in the United States. I mean, look at the size of Starbucks, for example. It's all about coffee. So in these studies, they only look at drinking coffee and they say time and time again how great it is for your liver, that practically every known liver disease, coffee improves it. Fatty liver disease, hepatitis C, alcoholic cirrhosis, right? They say in these articles coffee is good for all those conditions. So it would make sense that if you delivered the coffee straight to the liver and you could bypass the other effects, the jitteriness, the addiction, all of that, you would get even more improvement for the liver and without any, issues that were adverse, like, dehydrating people through its diuretic effects, et cetera, et cetera. But no one's going to look at this because first of all, the cancer industry or other, they would lose money if people did coffee enemas. They wouldn't be able to sell their hepatitis C drug, that costs 100,000 plus a year. But with coffee, they can say, oh, it's not going to cure anything. It'll improve the outcomes. And then the coffee industry is like really happy because they're making tons of money. And then they can have Starbucks booths in the hospital, and then the hospital takes a cut of the coffee sales. I mean, that's how things work in that system.
Right. Yeah. I was just speaking on a different show about the only thing that's better than owning the entire market is owning both sides of the market. Because then whatever option you have, you're still winning. And I think that kind of ties into like with someone such as yourself who has been through the allopathic model in terms of your training and how that kind of operates and the amount of pressure that's involved with not straying from the system and the financial pressure of putting you into so much debt so that you don't do anything but toe the line, because if you speak out you have all of this baggage behind you. And people, I believe, have a really hard time of understanding that there's so much darkness within people, or they're just so unbelievably different than us, because people generally are good people and they operate a certain way day to day, and they can't comprehend that these sort of things are happening behind them. But I was wondering about sort of like this concept of the allopathic flywheel of essentially buying the medicine and then teaching the theory behind that while also funding the institutions and the research, and then backing that into politics, and then having it in the media as well. And then you just have, it's essentially the flywheel of this is how people just understand these things. And it's not that everyone's in on the lie. It's that they just own the entire market of this sort of thought form.
Yeah, absolutely. And this, as you mentioned, my earlier documentary, Hippocratic Hypocrisy, it really goes into how this all initially was set up through the Flexner Report and started with changing the education system of doctors over to almost exclusively this cut, burn, poison allopathic model. And that was a way to support the burgeoning pharmaceutical industry, which was greatly expanded based on petroleum-based products. Previously, some of the main medicines that they were using in allopathic medicine were based on mercury and arsenic. So they're essentially just, giving obvious poisons to people, even to, toddlers who were teething. They gave mercury to the point that they had diarrhea, and, then they stopped teething. So, or at least, some of them may have, I'm not sure. So this kind of set up the system, and you're right. I mean, it's all infiltrated by, one group of stakeholders, really. The top professors in the medical schools are all on the payroll of the drug companies. There's this back and forth revolving door between the government regulating agencies like the FDA and such, and pharmaceutical industry and medical device industry. You have the CDC, which is really funded privately by the medical device and pharmaceutical and health insurance industries. So they're all, in the health insurance industry versus the other industries have to have a balance, because, if there are too much prescriptions that the insurance has to pay for, they don't make as much profit So they all, negotiate these things. And then the CDC is a way that they can give the appearance of the government supporting essentially their corporate marketing policies and strategies.
Right. Yeah. And early on, you were on Owen Benjamin's podcast, which I thought was amazing. For once, I saw you on Crow, and I was like, this dude is a legit doctor talking about this. And then I saw you on Owen Benjamin. I went, this doctor is a legit dude. But he is a fantastic at breaking down the spells, especially in with comedy, but also in, I guess, storytelling. And I think that there's so much within the emotions of these concepts, and I think that that's why they take such good care about putting this into the media in certain regards, is because once you dismantle the concept, because we it's like we understand in narrative, right? It's why essentially you teach your kids not logically of like, well, this is why you shouldn't tell a lie. You tell them the boy who cried wolf, and they understand it like that, right? It's why
Yeah,
the Greek.
allegory.
Exactly. And I think that that's why but it is important to think logically with the trivium, the quadrivium, which is why we're not being taught about that. And it's how they're basically,
Right. Well, I'm actually trying to base my kids' homeschooling about around the trivium and quadrivium.
yeah, exactly. And it's pushing a lot of people to go to these kind of regards as well. And I just think that because it's almost like there's so much emotions tied up in the actual moment of watching, say, a movie about a cancer survivor or something. There's also the moment that you're having with your family or with your father or your son when you're wrapped up under that blanket or something like that, watching this, and you're moved so intensely by this that, and then you have a family member who's going through something similar, right? And then someone such as yourself starts to say, hey, there's a different concept, there's a different paradigm that we can kind of move to that actually is the correct paradigm. You're not only dismantling the concept itself, but all of that emotion that's wrapped up within that sort of thought form that's in their mind.
Right. Well, this is an excellent point. And, there is this, of course, relationship, that between what we know and how we feel. And, I mean, look at the example of fear, right? Fear is generally based on a lack of knowledge or on misinformation, right? Rather than an actual threat, or at least it's, used that way by the media to manipulate. And, this is well documented, not just a theory. But the presence of emotion alters the ability to receive information and process it in a logical manner. And when you try to have a discussion with other people, then you have to be very weary about emotion entering in because it's a barrier to true communication. You mentioned before, why it's difficult and people are so resistant to have this conversation. And it's really because largely of their emotional response, because as a consequence of this new information, you have to make some major changes in your life if you accept it as true. And that creates, this real dissonance. And so you've seen this a lot with medical and scientific professionals, who want to hold. They realize that there's all this fraud in the pandemic, but they don't want to go to the deep layer and kind of question the main, paradigm of medicine. So they don't want to look at germ theory or at the proof of viruses at all, because if they did that, then they couldn't prescribe another antibiotic, or they couldn't get another grant, or they'd have to look at what they're studying and say, oh, is this wrong too? Do I have to rethink my entire career? All of this kind of thing. And then there are people attached to other aspects that make it very threatening, like, oh, the government is a benevolent, institution. I can't imagine my grandmother, was in Nazi Germany or in the Russian Revolution, and that would never happen in the United States. I can't face it. So there's a lot of these stumbling blocks. And, so if you are trying to have this discourse with someone and you detect this emotion, you should, not push any further. Like, if anything, like, acknowledge the emotion. Say, oh, it's kind of scary to think that this stuff might not be true. Or would you rather talk about this another time? How's your Aunt Betty doing? To sort of, just ease the tension a little bit and see if they're open. maybe they're open to exploring the emotion. But you know, if you try to continue, a lot of times it can just lead to anger and conflict, and there won't be any real discourse. And it's just unfortunate that this kind of polarization has occurred, because it really has separated many people from each other.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's something that I was playing around with the idea in my head about the larger structure of the media and pop culture and whatnot, and how since the seems like since the sort of industrial revolution and now this sort of new technological one that we're kind of living in, there's all this relation from the body and us as a technological thing. Your body is a machine, or your mind is just like a computer, and it's just taking you away from the actual truth behind the ecosystem that we're in, the symbiosis, the organism that we are in relation to that. And it's almost like people don't want to look into health. Even such as myself, when I started to realize this, I was like, man, I have to change so much of my life to be sort of logically consistent with going towards health. And we're so far away from nature that a lot of people don't want to go towards that, because they have to literally change almost every single thing in their lives.
Well, you can see how with each new generation that there's more and more integration of technology into their day-to-day life from a younger and younger age, as if, you know, we are moving towards living our life in a virtual reality rather than in actual reality. And of course, all of the, you know, migration into large cities, which is really encouraged on a even grander scale in the Agenda 2030 and other such documents, it brings you further and further away from the natural world. And you know, we don't know how to interact with nature in a basic way, how to produce food, what plants and animals are harmful or how they behave. You know, all of this has been generally lost from the common knowledge. And this is all leading towards the transhuman type of agenda, you know, to essentially create a new life form that's partly human and partly technology. And all of this is rooted in this philosophical foundation of materialism or reductionist materialism. And this is also, you know, behind the scenes related to the germ theory, terrain theory paradigm shift as well, because, you know, and they had to take out consciousness or the possibility of creative or superior intelligence from science to create this philosophy of nihilism, that there is nothing beyond this material life. And then from that, you can, you know, create decadence and consumerism, and people can behave as if nothing matters because they have such a limited time and they might as well get what they can out of it. And that is, I think, what makes people vulnerable to all this misleading information and, you know, to march towards or away from humanity. I mean, maybe, and, you know, many people that actually promote this transhuman agenda, there even are political parties that are in favor of it. They talk about it in the context of immortality, right? That somehow your consciousness can be imprinted in a technological form that doesn't, you know, degrade or have a limited existence on the physical earth. So, you know, to achieve this, they had to basically figure out ways to either cover up or change the results of some very important key experiments done, like in physics, like the Michelson-Morley experiment, like the double slit experiment and such, in order to kind of cover up that there is actually something beyond matter, right? We have the ether, we have consciousness, and it affects the behavior of material in the physical world. And so, you know, what we're talking about now is really, let's begin to uncover the truths about these things. Let's look at the world in a more realistic way. And you realize once you start doing that, that it becomes much more humanized, that the, you know, you get back to a true way of living, you know, as a man or woman in this, you know, beautiful environment. It may have been damaged over the years through, you know, a lot of abuse, but there's still, you know, so much beauty and abundance to behold in our natural world. You know, I want to get back closer to that way of existing.
Right. And I think that that isn't that the difficulty with deception, is that there's enough truth within it that makes you believe it, but it will take you off the course enough that you won't be on the right path in terms of uploading your consciousness so you can kind of live forever. Well, that's these old concepts of the ether, and that you're not just your body, you're not just your emotions, you're not just your thoughts, you are something else. So it's like it is true what you're saying, but it's for not for the correct purpose. And I'm wondering, it's to move into this new space that you're talking about. I guess it's you and Tom have spoke about the importance of understanding this concept right now at this time, because if we don't, we're just going to repeat this cycle over and over again, like we have since time immemorial. So I was wondering, what is the significance for something like Dr. Stefan Lanka's recent experiments, and how does that relate to things like the Koch's postulates and Rivers postulates? So, and how can we understand that completely so that we can move into this new paradigm?
Well, yeah, this is actually pretty simple to understand because, and the significance of it is that it provides actually a confirmatory experiment that shows conclusively that the main level of proof offered for the existence of a virus in a biological sample is actually invalid. And this just comes from the basic process of performing a control experiment. So anytime you want to test something, you perform a control experiment to make sure that the results come from what you're testing and not just from the procedure itself that you're doing, right? So, for example, if you want to say test the colligative properties of water, so what's water's boiling point, if it's pure water, or is it changed by salt? So you don't just put salt in the water and test the boiling point of that. You have two pots. You have one with just water and one with salt. And the one with just water is the control. So you say, okay, just pure water by itself boils at 100 degrees centigrade, and then the salt solution, you do the experiment and with the thermometer, and you see, okay, it is right around 100. It says 100.1, but your thermometer has some error. So you're like, that's pretty close. Then you have the other pot with the salt, and then that, boils at 100.5. So it's higher temperature. And then you know that the effect was from the salt because you compared it to that control experiment without the salt. Now, for the proof of when they discover a new virus, they offer really traditionally, until just recently, they offered two levels of proof, but they were really kind of, one was based on the other. So what they did is they took a biological sample from a sick person they thought may have a virus, and they put this in a cell culture of foreign cells, and they say that they're culturing the virus. And then what they observe is that a few days after they set up this culture, they see damage to the cells. They're growing abnormally, and it's called cytopathic effects. Essentially means cell disease. Cyto is cell, and pathos is disease. So they attribute the damage of the cell culture to as proof that there's a virus in that sample in that patient. But they don't do a control study where they say, would they get cytopathic effects if they did the same experiment from a healthy patient, right? So they took the same, fluid, lung fluid, or, nasal swab, or, stool, whatever biological sample. They could take the same one from a healthy person, put it in the same cell culture with exactly the same conditions, right? Because they add a lot of toxic chemicals to those cell cultures. And then look under the microscope and say, do they get cytopathic effects in that cell culture? And if they did, they would say, oh, it's from the experiment itself. It has nothing to do with a virus because we don't have a virus in the control experiment at all, right? And so that control experiment, and you're supposed to, every time you do an experiment, you're supposed to always do a control. In fact, when I was at MIT doing bench science, or I worked at a couple of biotech companies, Genzyme, Biogen, whenever we were doing experiments, we would always have a control. Okay, so it wasn't like something we just left out sometimes when we felt like it, or if the science was established, we didn't do it because there's always unknown factors. Like maybe there's humidity in the lab at the time that affects it, or someone accidentally coughs or sneezes on it and you don't notice it. Anything can happen in a laboratory. You measure something out wrong, all kinds of things. So you always have to do this for quality control and validity measures. And they never do this in these virus experiments. They did it only one time, and it was the scientist who developed the procedure, whose name is John Enders. And this was in 1954. And when he did the control, he showed actually that you get the same result when you don't have the virus in the experiment. Now, subsequently, everyone just seemed to ignore this. Um, well, they ignored it in a way that they didn't say, okay, well, that means this experiment's invalid, because that would be the proper conclusion. But instead, they said, we better not do any control experiments because they'll invalidate our work. So they never have done a control experiment since that time. Now, sometimes they try to do these fake controls experiments that they call mock infected cells. But that's not a real control. They don't even disclose the methods that they use in the paper. That's just an attempt to make it appear like they're doing a control. I've even tried to correspond with some of the scientists on those papers, and they essentially won't divulge the actual procedures. So that's kind of a sham. And what Lanka did was he said, all right, I'm going to repeat the control experiment because no one does it, and I'm going to show again that I get the same results as Enders. And he did it, and he didn't use any biological sample at all, actually. He just did it with a cell culture and the chemicals. And he showed the same cytopathic effects occurring. Now, this is not, published in a peer-reviewed journal because of the fear from the scientist that she'll be fired and censured if she even submits it for publication. So it's only been, it has been released publicly, but some people may criticize it because it hasn't been published. But I'll tell you that according to even the mainstream people in the scientific publishing industry, like Professor Ioannidis at Stanford, more than half of all the published articles have false conclusions. So you can't rely on just the fact that something's published in a prestigious journal or a peer-reviewed journal that it's accurate. In fact, more than likely, it's inaccurate. So you have to be skeptical of everything, including Lanka's research. But, I have definitely looked at it very closely, and I've grilled him on all the procedures. And, I might have done the experiment slightly differently, but that doesn't mean that his results are not completely valid. And it's exactly what was predicted to observe. And, he has released the actual images of the cell cultures, so you can look at it yourself.
And this is what I think is so fascinating about diving into these subjects is everything is riding on this, and they just made this assumption, and now we have this $1 trillion industry going on that can't be stopped. Really, it's like the leviathan that you just can't kind of
Right.
pull the reins in.
Well, it wasn't just an assumption, really. What happened is that this cell culture procedure was actually a manufacturing process. And it was to manufacture polio vaccines. And John Enders, who developed it, he got the Nobel Prize for it. So then after he used it to help develop that vaccine, he used it to do some experiments with polio. Now, he didn't actually say in these experiments that these cytopathic effects prove that polio is in the sample at all. But after the Nobel Prize and the success commercially of the vaccine, and also, that the polio vaccine is in the mainstream attributed to be the greatest miracle of modern medicine, right? So that had quite a huge influence. And so virologists began adapting that procedure, which could manufacture a vaccine, also as the proof that that virus is existing or causing that disease in the first place. So it's a very efficient way to manufacture vaccines that both the manufacturing process provides both the product and the proof that the product should be made in one step. And, this is very analogous to the use of the PCR test in modern medicine, because that also is a manufacturing procedure. It's used to manufacture copies of genetic material. And it has now also been used as a way to provide proof of something, whereas it doesn't really provide that. It's never been validated, but there is the appearance and the misuse of this procedure in that way.
This is what I find crazy about it is that from what I can understand from what you guys are saying, it's almost like them basically saying we have this thing in a video game and then we're testing something with the test for the thing in the video game and it's coming up with the same result. You're like, but it's from a computer, like it doesn't have existence in reality. And like, yes, but this is what our tests are showing. And you're like, but how are you seeing that that has any reality in like the world that we're living in? And it's so fascinating to go, these are the people that are, running these trillion-dollar companies and putting policies in place and all that kind of stuff. And when you guys kind of grill them on these things and say, why can't, if it doesn't exist outside of the cell, how does it transfer from, you know what I mean? It's like fascinating that you go, how is this still the current paradigm?
Right. Well, this is a fundamental problem in experimental biology and probably in other experimental sciences as well, that for biology, it underwent this molecular biology revolution, and that began with the discovery of DNA and its supposed double helix structure, and then molecular tests started being developed and used. A lot of it is with antibodies, it's with genetics. PCR was a major contribution because that's why it was awarded a Nobel Prize. But what took place is that there was a shift in experiments from doing experiments with actual organisms like animals, bacteria or single-celled organisms, to doing experiments in vitro, meaning outside of the body in the laboratory, in a petri dish, in a test tube. And so that's not, what happens in a test tube is not necessarily what happens in a living organism, in an ecosystem, right, in nature. But because of the power and convenience of all of this molecular biological lab procedures and tests and techniques, they could do experiments very easily. Like they didn't have to wait a lifespan of an animal. They didn't have to, maintain the expense of keeping the animals to do experiments and such. So it was much more convenient and yielded more quicker results. And it was it took off like a trend. I mean, people thought, oh, this is how we're really going to understand, how organisms work. And what they lost in the way is that they never did confirmatory studies to say that what they found in vitro is actually what happens in an organism. And so it's lost its way and it's producing all kinds of false information because it's an artificial simulated construct. So there's some crazy examples of this, by the way, which are done. So one is I was looking into the toxicity of graphene and graphene oxide because that was talked about so much. And it was almost impossible to find a study where they actually gave graphene to animals and then saw what happened to them. Instead, what they did is they put graphene in cell cultures and they looked for molecules that were supposedly a marker for this or a marker for that, right? These biomarkers. But are those things really, a marker? Like, have they really fully been validated? Does that really represent what would happen if graphene were in an actual organism? And they're drawing all kinds of conclusions based on these things instead of saying, hey, what happens in an actual animal, when that's the only accurate way to determine it, until there's some kind of model that really rings true. But that's never been shown to happen. They never compare the model to the thing. Now with the variants of COVID, it's even more ridiculous. And I found out this from doing some, investigative work on the CDC page where it's talking about variants and how they get characterized as being of concern or, or that kind of thing. And they never actually get the variant from nature. Instead, what they do is they, have like this computer video game where they say that the genetic sequence of the variant is different from the other COVIDs. But then they take that computer sequence, they use a RNA or a synthesizer in the laboratory, a machine, to make that different sequence, and then they put that in essentially a nanoparticle that is called a synthetic pseudovirus. And then they study that. Now, why the hell wouldn't they get the actual virus? Like, it's killing millions of people. There's plenty of it available. They could just get some of that and do the research. But instead, they go through this painstaking method to, construct a synthetic pseudovirus. Now, why would they do that if the real thing existed? Right? It doesn't make sense. And then they're drawing conclusions based on that, you know, simulation. But, so they're basically making something that doesn't exist in nature, then studying it, and then using those results to say this is what happens in nature. Right? It's completely illogical. And, it's obviously wrong, but no one is looking at it this way. They're just saying, this is what I'm taught to do. This is where the funds are coming from. I can't find the real variant virus in nature. No one else can, or else they would be giving me a sample.
Right. And that's why I think the work that you guys are doing, you, Tom, Lenka, Amanda, it's so important, because it's so logical. And it's just wild that from someone who's not in this industry at all, listens to these two arguments, right? Or these two kind of thought patterns of what possibly could be the correct paradigm, that what you just described sounds absolutely insane. So I was wondering, I've listened to you on a number of shows and platforms, and I'm wondering, you've talked about the Hermetic principles and these idea of going to nature and the more kind of spiritual and philosophical questions of our time. So if true health then is also related to things like German new medicine and working with this symbiosis with nature, and that we're a part of this, and their concept is to shut us off from this and not understand our healing powers, I think is the main goal here. So if that's essentially scares them so much, and if everything is an offer in our world, we're just being offered this kind of path to kind of go down. What is, in your opinion, what is going on in the world right now with that offer? Like, what is being offered to us, and what lesson can we learn here?
Do you mean like what's being offered by the way our health systems are changing?
Well, I guess if we look at things that in a more sort of spiritual sense, things are offered to us for a choice of a path that we can go down. And I feel like there's a clear kind of fork in the road here, and we have two choices to go down. What do you think is on both sides of that offer?
Well, there are a lot of spiritual principles that you kind of invoke, and an offer implies like an agreement or a contract, and that's actually one of the highest order types of things that can occur between individual men and women, right? Because what we're saying is that we are going to work together, but we're going to do it in a fair and equitable way, and so we're going to have this negotiation and decide what's best for both of us. And if it turns out that we can't agree, then we can dissolve or not, and entangle ourselves that way. And that invokes our true agency and autonomy as individual men and women with our own spark of divinity, put on the earth probably to learn, classroom earth, and we can play out our destiny and our role in that manner. I feel that the powers, that you could call them globalists, the elites, empire, dark occultists, but essentially the people who are running the world, right? The Klaus Schwabs, they're puppets in government leadership positions, the United Nation, the World Health Organization, Rockefeller Foundation, all of those globalist groups that are setting the policy years in advance and pulling the strings and putting their associates in positions of power and such. They can, in order for them to operate in the way that they want to and gain full control of the world into, kind of a one world government system with major surveillance and control over people, that's essentially the offer that they're putting forth. And they want everyone to, at a minimum, assent to it. So in other words, go along without protest, sort of agree by default. If they go against people's will, they run into problems. Like one is just resistance from people, right? And people may get violent or may not buy their products or not participate, and there are very few of them and very many people, so they are fear of that. And that's why you see the pattern of events, like when people were really protesting and getting frustrated, and you had the truckers convoy was reaching a stalemate. You see what happened is that they just quietly made that go away and diverted everyone's attention and backed off all the restrictions and such, because they didn't want to be put out of business, and they didn't want the people to rise up and say, hey, no more, we're getting you out of power, and then that would set them back quite a bit. So they want to get you to go along with these things, and so they create the conditions and use essentially public relations propaganda techniques through many, many, avenues, from the way that you were accultured and conditioned through your compulsory schooling, the role of the news media and the communications, the censorship through social media platforms, right? It's a comprehensive program. You get the same messages coming from every angle, that it would manipulate you into a position that you would go along with it. So when they, said to stay at home, you would stay at home. When they said to wear masks and social distance, you would do those things. When they told you to get vaccinated, you would, etc. And ultimately, when they asked you to sign up for the ID card or the QR code or whatever, that you went along with that. And so these are all offers, that are put out there, although they're using a lot of coercion and manipulation to get people to go along with it. None of these things are actually compulsory. None of them can be legally or lawfully required. And you can simply opt out of all of these things. Like I've opted out of all of those things. And many other things in society also are voluntary, but we don't see it this way. And, it's a combination of spiritual learning and development, so that you have, discernment, for example, which is a word that I almost never heard before the pandemic, and I hear it out of everyone's mouth now because it's so vital and timely, that you can understand that these things aren't required. Like the recent federal judge ruling that, finally got rid of masks in airplanes, the whole time it was illegal. Right? And, like I knew that, many people knew that. And if everyone said we're not doing it, of course they couldn't, enforce it, but they basically intimidated people. And the government knew, by the way, that it was illegal. And that's why they never enforced it. Like TSA didn't make people wear masks in the airport. Like lots of people walked through TSA with no mask. It was the airline staff that enforced it, right? Private people working for a private company. And they somehow thought that they were empowered to, violate your rights, even though they could have been, actually arrested, even according to federal statute. But certainly, they could have been sued, and many people were successfully sued. And that's why this happened, because of a lawsuit, right? But all these people just went along with it. They let the flight attendants boss them around, right? And they could have just said, well, I'm not flying then. And no one would go on the plane. The airlines couldn't do it then. They would be forced not to. I mean, they were already hit really hard. But when the government said that we want you to require people to wear masks, they also said, if you do this, here's a lot of money that, you can use to stay in business. And and this kind of scheme worked, and you see how it's working outside the law, really, but it's still giving you this offer and coercing you. Like, so the offer is, if you want to get on my plane, you have to do this, right? So my response to that offer was, no, thank you. I won't get on your plane. So I put a lot of miles on my truck. Unfortunately, I couldn't, drive to Europe, but I would have probably if there was a bridge.
Yeah.
But that's what we have to be willing to walk away in order to uphold our own individual sovereignty and choice. And that, takes a willingness to sacrifice whatever that is. And, so many people, and it's personally, it's kind of disappointing to hear people tell this, but it's part of the process. That at first you recognize that things are not right and you're being manipulated or misled, and then you start to learn the truth. But then the most important part of that is then embodying that in your day-to-day life, in your livelihood, in your behavior, right? So recently I've encountered people who, they understood that all of this is not true. They understood the consequences of it for encroaching on our freedom. But yet, in order to stay in with their group of friends who bought the mainstream false narrative, they actually went and got tested all the time so they could tell their friends they were negative. And they actually contributed to lockdown policies because of their getting that testing, right? Or somebody who is, completely aware of everything that's going on and very much against it and concerned, but then works for a company that develops gene editing technology, which is going to be used to, further harm us. So we have to, really think about our actions and behaviors once we open our mind to the truth, and make sure that we're not actually, perpetuating the very thing that we're trying to protect ourselves from and fight against.
I could not agree more. And I know we're short on time here, Andrew, but I want to thank you so much for your time and the work that you're doing and continuing to sort of beat this drum, even 2 years into it and everything like that. And I just want to, where can people find you? Where can people find your work if they want to support you, find out anything about you, what you've got going on?
Yeah, well, I have much going on, and everything is available on andrewkaufmanmd.com. You may want to go to terrainthefilm.com. Also, if you haven't seen the film, and actually we're next month we're going to do another live stream of the film because we're releasing it with all the foreign language captioning, so it'll be like the international release. And then I'm going to be doing a workshop after that on the way of water. And this is going to be a new series of workshops trying to introduce this new paradigm of terrain medicine. So I'm going to, essentially teach people how to drink, not alcohol, but water, because we've really lost all this knowledge. And, virtually everyone with a health problem who comes to me is dehydrated. So we're gonna, I'm on a mission to try and reverse that, and so that's, what I'm really excited about coming up. But there are many more things going on all the time. So please sign up for my newsletter and check out all of the resources and media I have.
Awesome. Yeah, we just jumped on to your newsletter for the workshop you did with Amanda Vollmer, which was amazing, about DMSO and all that stuff. So everyone get over there, sign up to the mailing list, get involved with everything that Andrew's got going on. Thank you so much for your time, sir. I really appreciate it, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
All right. It's my pleasure, and take care, everyone.
How many of you are dreaming about a homestead? Do you know how you would even go about doing that? Have you sat down and planned out how you are going to grow what you want? Do you even know where to start or what you even want? If you have no idea how to do that, check out episode 12 I did with Jim Gale from Food Forest Abundance. Imagine walking out your backyard and having everything you love to eat growing right there for you without having years of experience growing or the hardships of losing crops, stressing about what will work and what won't. Food Forest Abundance specializes in developing a unique permaculture garden in your backyard with their experienced team. You send them info about your space, what you love to eat, what you would want to grow, and they put together a plan to make it a reality. Then they either install it for you, you do it on your own, or a blend of both and work on it together. That way there's no intimidation and you know it's being done correctly by professionals and you will learn how it's done for the future. Food Forest Abundance has even had Entourage star Adrian Grenier contact them, seeing the importance, brilliance, and necessity of what they're doing. In 3 to 4 years, you could have more free food than you know what to do with, all while doing absolutely no work at all. Click the link below to learn more about Food Forest Abundance and start growing your own food. Have you been wanting to learn how to reserve your rights? How about keeping your work and life in the private? Tom Barnett is doing great work that I want to let you know about. He and Dave Armstrong at the Living Free movement are providing the resources that you need. In addition to legal templates, weekly Q&As, and workshops, they're now providing a number of other resources under their platform, such as Heal Me, Spiritual Me, Grow Me, Lawful Me, Feed Me, and Private Business Me, which provides resources for private trusts and foundations to move businesses and assets into the private. I've been studying Tom's work and many others for over 2 years now, and I can say that it's some of the best out there, and these resources are life-changing and fundamental to understand. If there ever was a no-brainer chance to get access to everything that you need, from health to spirituality to food, sourcing, and lawful strategies, as well as joining and growing a solution-based community, this is it. Head to the links below for Tom and Dave at the Living Free Movement and email info@healme.health and let them know that Rob over at Dig Within sent you. If you're like me and sometimes have trouble getting a full night's sleep, it's probably just a magnesium deficiency. I take 2 capsules of Bioptimizer's Magnesium Breakthrough and it gives me the best night's sleep of my life. Their magnesium supplement is the best on the market because it's the only one that provides all 7 forms of magnesium in 1 capsule. Bioptimizers is the #1 selling natural digestive supplements in the market because they're completely natural and small batch produced to ensure the highest quality of their products. Their Massime supplements is another one of their best sellers. It helps you digest 3 times more protein that you eat, so it's a must if you're trying to achieve any fitness goals, as well as it's just a great one for everyone to have for general digestion of protein. It helps you save big on buying and eating more protein to feel full. Instead of buying more, digest more. They also have HCl for acid reflux, an amazing probiotic with P3OM, a constipation and herbal parasite cleanse if you're having digestive problems, and Gluten Guardian, an amazing supplement to help you digest gluten if you're having trouble avoiding it, but find yourself, you're at a party or you want to let loose every once in a while. You can bypass that bloated food coma with that, and you'll feel great on cheat meals or cheat days. Some of the best biohackers and holistic health practitioners rave about Bioptimizers, including Paul Chek, Ben Greenfield, and many, many more. It's definitely worth checking out, and you can save on some bundle deals by using the link below. If you haven't yet, check out last week's episode with Blake Ward over at Seed. They make the best and actual stylish hemp clothing around. They're a conscious hemp clothing, actually fashionable, stylish, and unbelievably comfy. Their harem crotch makes it unisex, super comfy, and easy to wear. They're my favorite thing that I found over the last few years, and the only pants I wear now. What I do is size them up or down depending on what I want to wear them for, and it's not like typical pants where they're way too tight or way too big because they have an elastic waistband and not a traditional button and zipper. And what I absolutely love about the company is that they are made in Cochrane, Alberta, driven to make a change in the world. No part of the process is done in the third world. They're all sewn here locally, and all of their employees make above minimum wage. Head over to theseedstore.ca to grab a pair. They have a 20% discount offer for being a new customer by signing up to their mailing list, and honestly, you're going to love them, so buy as many as you can with that 20% off. And if you want to buy more pairs in the future, you can use my discount code DIGWITHIN to save 15% off on your subsequent orders. What if you could heal most of your ailments by simply breathing or drinking water? Check out episode 21 earlier this month with George Wiseman to learn about his Aquacure AC50 and the healing power of Brown's gas. His machine rehydrogenates your water molecules, reinvigorating you and replenishing your cells, informing your system that it finally has what it needs to fix any deficiencies in your system. You can inhale the gas through the breathing tube provided if you sit at the computer during the day, or recharge the water you drink so your body gets more nutrients if you're on the go. In just 10 minutes, we charge our water here every morning for the day. I now drink nothing else but this. In episode 21, George goes over the many reviews of people who have cleared up numerous physical ailments after using his machine. And George even details a touching story of someone who overcame the very disease that his late wife succumbed to from using this machine he invented. George even talks about how it can help with radiation and even accounts of chemotherapy, so it can potentially help with something about the number 5 and the letter G. This is an unknown gem in the field. If you watch alternative doctors like Amanda Vollmer or Tom Cowan, you can see this machine in the background of their conversations. It's a great way to safeguard your health and well-being and feel better every day. They've been backed up and sold out with the amount of people catching on to this amazing technology. So click the link below and save before they're sold out again. By using the discount code DIGWITHIN, you can save 20% off at the checkout, which is a $500 savings. If you're in Ontario and want access to the best possible food you can get your hands on, head over to wildmeadowsfarm.ca for everything that you need. They've got the best grass-fed, grass-finished food that you can find. I love their nose-to-tail ground beef, which is 80% ground beef and 20% organ meats, because organ meats are the best things you can consume. And it's what our ancestors coveted more than anything else when they were hunting. And this is the best way to reintroduce them into your diet. They have everything from chicken, beef, bison, lamb, elk, duck, pepperettes, broth, bones, fermented food, eggs, and dairy. They even have a discount section on their website, as great food is a bit more expensive, so they cater to whatever you need. And also, if you're a bear, head over to the Beartaria Times app to find them in Ontario there, and they offer a discount code only to bears. It's the best food I've found in Ontario, and you won't be disappointed.